A few months ago, we were headed over to Lauren's parents for family dinner. We loaded up the kids, and on our way, my wife said to me, hey, when we get there, I might have something for you to do. My mom's phone has been doing strange things. And I'm thinking, that's weird. What's wrong with her iPhone? I mean, iPhones don't do a lot of strange stuff. She said, well, the phone will turn on and off, and then turn on and off. It's draining the battery. It's kind of weird. She's not even pushing anything. It just does that on its own. I'm like, that is really strange. So when we get there, we get all the kids situated, taken care of, and I asked my mother-in-law for her phone, and she hands it over, and sure enough, it turns on in my hand. I'm like, that's weird, So I'm watching it, and it turns off, and I've never seen this before. It's a virus or what? So I start to investigate. It's an older model iPhone than the one that I had, and I'm looking for the power button to see if I can manually override it. And I'm like, this dumb case, where'd she get this case? And I look at it a little bit more, and I realize that she put the case on upside down. It was holding the power button in, turning the phone off and on. And so I took the case off and put it on the right side up, and I handed it back to her, and I'm like, hey, there you go, it's fixed. She's like, well, what was wrong? I said, mother-in-law, listen, you know what, when you put your phone case on right side up, things go a whole lot smoother, We had a good little laugh over that because, when things are right side up, when relationships are right side up, it makes sense. They feel great. When you're at work and you're at school and things are right side up, what happens? What do you feel? You feel like you're a valued part of the team, the group. You feel like your contributions matter, that you're learning and you're engaging and it works. It's right side up. When you're talking about the relationships with our friends or our family members, when things are right side up, we are celebrating life's ups, and you have a group of people who are with you when it doesn't go so well. It's a group of people that you can laugh with and enjoy life with. Man, that feels great, doesn't it? Or romantically, when things are right side up, you're connected, you're committed to each other, you have this love and respect, this intimacy. When relationships are right side up, everything seems to work, but what happens when they turn upside down? It's draining, isn't it? You can't see eye to eye. Strange things start happening in those relationships. And it's like your world is dizzy, and it's like you try to solve it. You try to talk about it. And sometimes it makes things even worse. And so what do? We keep it to ourselves. We pretend. We're not pretend, but I'm just going to give it a little bit of space, and maybe we will get through it. Maybe we talk to our other friends at work about what's happening at home, or we talk to our friends at home about what's happening at work or in our marriage or vice versa. Sometimes we reach out for articles and suggestions, therapists, but when things are upside down, it's like we are desperate for anything that will help. And so over the next few weeks, I'm going to suggest that we look at Jesus. We're going to look at the Bible, and it's some of the upside-down principles. That means when you first read them or hear them, you're going to be like, I don't think that'll work. I've heard that before. They just talk about that in the Bible. I've tried that, and it didn't change anything. But we say that following Jesus makes life better and makes us better at life. And by that, I mean when you actually follow what Jesus is teaching, which means you have to engage a little bit with what he's teaching to understand some of the context and some of what he's driving towards. It'll change the way that you live out your relationships, even if you don't agree with us on who Jesus says he is. And so even if you're skeptical or searching, if you just kind of read what Jesus says, and our hope, our desire would be that you come to the same conclusion that we have, that Jesus is the Son of God, and he came to accomplish some pretty significant stuff for us for all of eternity. But even if you're not ready for that, by following these upside-down principles, I think, not just follow them, they're not a magic button or a magic wand, but by applying them to your life, you might begin to see some of your relationships turn right side up. And so at the end of the month, we're going to be talking about conflict. What are the upside-down principles? What is an upside-down principle that could turn our conflict at work, at home, in your marriage right side up again? In a couple of weeks, October 21st and 22nd, this is a little narrower audience, but I think it impacts many, if not most of us. It's going to be, what are the upside-down principles that turn our romantic relationships right side up in bed? Oh yeah, some guy's like, I'm writing that date down, October 21st and 22nd, don't miss church, you know. You're not going to, and it's going to be fun. Next week, we're going to talk about the upside down principles that turn our work right side up, whether that's professionally or anything productively that you have to do with other people. And so this week, I actually changed the way that I was going to kick off the series. Because I want to talk about an upside down principle that I think applies to any relationship that you have, but is specific response to the upside down that we're experiencing in our culture right now, in our country right now. I mean, just think about what we've been dialoguing, debating, arguing, dividing over the last couple of years. It's been draining. Strange things have been happening. I mean, just think about the last few months, right? Charlottesville, hurricanes, then you've got the NFL protests, heated debate around that. Then, last week, the tragic shooting in Las Vegas. What we have endured over the last few years, and specifically few months, at times leaves me exhausted. You know what's challenging? Is through those events, instead of our country coming together, it would appear we're dividing even more separately, more further apart. I mean, think about what's happening on social media. I know not all of you, some of you have given it up. Why? Because social media was designed to connect people, and instead it's now being leveraged as an amplifier for what you're doing wrong and this and that and fight, you're no more. It drives me crazy. And then so what do? We start blaming the news media. The news media, they're evil, they're wrong, they would get it right. They're the ones who should fix this. Do you know what the news media was created to do? Point out problems. That's why they exist. So to expect them to bring solutions, that's not what the news is for. So let's stop pointing fingers there. And you know what? Yeah, we can blame the government. We can blame the officials, the Democrats, the Republicans, the president. You know what? The government has been trying to solve some of these problems since the very beginning. And so I was thinking about this week. I'm like, well, is there an upside down principle? Let me say it this way. What if today we stop waiting for someone else to bring the solution and start living it ourselves? Instead of pointing to everybody else, what if Jesus actually had an upside down principle for all sides? No matter what side you're on, gay, straight, for guns, against guns. I mean, for the NFL protest, against the NFL protest, for the Cleveland Indians, or for the Yankees. Yeah, sorry, man, that's painful, right? Whatever side you're on, what if there was a principle that could help us move forward? And I think today you're going to see one of those upside down principles. And I'm really excited about this topic because I'm going to say excited again, because I get excited about what it could mean for you, for me, for us, for our country. And so I am aware. I'm aware that what I'm stepping into, we all have a lot of personal feelings about. And I need to acknowledge that I'm not going to do it adequate justice in one weekend talk. In fact, I don't think this is a one weekend, all right, got that done, now we don't have to talk about that anymore. And so if I don't say the right phrase or deliver it the way that maybe you were hoping, I'm just going to ask for a little bit of grace. And I do want to say that this isn't a one-time thing. This is really intended to be a step. That I think if we take this step together, we could be a part of turning our communities and our conversations right side up again. And so, I'm going to pray and invite God to help make us better, to teach us, to give us a learning posture. And I would encourage you to take a deep breath, set aside distractions, and do the same. So, let's do that together. God, thank you for every person, every story, every heartache, every thrill, every challenge that's here. God, I pray that you would, in your own unique way, remind every person, whether they feel it or not, that they matter to you, that we matter to you more than we could ever imagine. And over the next few minutes, simply help us learn and receive whatever it is that we need to take with us today. Use me in any way that you can in the time we have together. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I really want to say, just for a moment, thanks. Thanks for coming. At all of our campuses. If you're tuning in from some device somewhere, Thank you for joining the conversation, especially those of you who are here for the first time. You're a special guest. My name is Ben. I'm the lead pastor, and I'm going to dive right in. The upside-down principle that we're going to look at this week is love your neighbor as yourself. And I know what some of you are thinking. That's not upside down. I mean, I talk about that all the time. I talk about the golden rule and how we should be more loving. I got it here on my t-shirt. I posted it on my blog page. I posted it over here. I talk about it with my friends. I got it quoted on my cubicle. And the truth is we do. We talk about it a lot. This past week on my own live video that I did on Facebook in response to Las Vegas, a lot of conversations. We should just love each other. And so maybe what is upside down about this statement is if we say it all the time, why doesn't it seem to be helping? I mean, sure, we talk about it. You talk about it. I talk about it. But in some ways, we're more divided now than ever. Maybe there is more upside down in this statement than we realize. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to go to the place where Jesus teaches on this. And we're going to look at Luke's biographical account of Jesus' life. Luke was not one of Jesus' disciples. In fact, Luke was put on an assignment by allegedly a wealthy Greek individual named Theophilus. And so Luke was sent out to collect eyewitness stories, and he did. He collected all of these accounts to put together an accurate description of who Jesus was and what he came to accomplish. In some ways, he was an eyewitness reporter. And so in Luke's account, he is one of my favorite gospel accounts. He gives this story that many of you are familiar with. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And I know, we tell the story of the Good Samaritan as helping people who were down and out. But there is so much more going on in this story than maybe you've seen or realized before. And so we're going to start at the beginning. You can follow along in your notes or on the screen. It says this in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. On one occasion, an expert of the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And so an expert in the law means a lawyer. And when you think about a lawyer in our day and time, no, I'm not talking about the cheesy billboards and stuff like that. I'm talking about what an actual lawyer does. Their job is to protect the law and also to protect the interest of whatever client that they have. A lawyer in Jesus' day did exactly the same thing. Their job was to protect the law. And so he was testing Jesus to protect the law, to validate, to verify that what Jesus was teaching was in fact true of what was written in the law. And if you're going, well, what was the law? This is what's fascinating. You know, the law is really it's those boring parts of the first part of the Bible that our eyes glaze over when we read them. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. You know, it's like, I have no idea what's talking about there. That's what a lawyer in Jesus' day was using to set up a judicial system. And what's remarkable about the Bible is that God gave Moses this judicial system thousands of years before this particular lawyer was in practice. In fact, what God gave Moses was so revolutionary that many Western cultures have built their judicial system in part on some of the things that was written in the Old Testament. Why? Because most of the kings in Moses' day simply made decrees, so let it be written, so let it be done. And what Moses was really building was a judicial system that was way more democratic. It didn't depend upon a king and decrees. It's fascinating when you look at it from this perspective. And so the lawyer was simply practicing the protection of the law. And on this particular day, he sees Jesus, a popular teacher, and he asks them a question that we all ask, whether you believe in Jesus or not. He looks at Jesus and he says, what are the most important things that I need to be thinking on, that we should be focused on in our life? What's the way to have eternal life? Man, what a great question. What should we be focused on? And I love how Jesus replies. Look at what he says. He says, what is written in the law? Jesus replied, how do you read it? You know what's amazing about that? You know what I love to do when people ask me a question? I mean, it's kind of what I do for a living. I tell people what I think. We tell people what we think. When we're asked a question, we love to tell people what we think. You know what Jesus does? He practices something different. Instead of telling everybody what he thinks all the time, he asks a question. Help me understand from your perspective. That's a great principle for us to just think about all that we're going through. You could stop right there and go, if we were to just ask more, help me understand questions, you know what difference that would make in our world instead of just pointing and telling everybody what we think and what's on our mind? And so Jesus honors the lawyer and says, you tell me what you read in the law. And so he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, maybe you've heard that verse before. It's been quoted. Jesus calls this even the greatest commandment at another part in the Bible. But everybody in the audience would have been nodding their heads. They would have been nodding their heads because the lawyer quoted what's called the Shema. The Shema goes all the way back to that Old Testament law in Deuteronomy 6, where it says to love God with all of our being. And in Leviticus 19, it tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. This was something that was prayed oftentimes by Jewish individuals twice a day. And so when he cites this back, the room is in agreement because they understand what it means to love. And that's where I think we may get stuck today for some of us. Because what does that word love mean? You see, in the Greek and Hebrew languages, there are multiple words for our one word love. I mean, when I say the word love, what comes to mind? Other than that romantic affection that we may think for some sweetheart in our life. I mean, when you ask kids what the word love means, it's fascinating the different definitions or descriptions that you get. For example, Danny, age 7, he says, love is when mommy makes coffee for my daddy, and then she takes a sip before giving it to him to make sure that it tastes okay. That's lovely. Mark is a little bit more honest. He says, love is when mommy sees daddy on the toilet and she doesn't think it's gross. If that's the case, then there's some non-loving people right now because some people still think it's gross, all right? My personal favorite was Carl. He says, love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. Is that what we're calling it these days? You know, it's like, let's smell each other. It's just, it's funny. I mean, we could come up with a lot of definitions of love, but if we could just be honest for a minute, I think when I think about love in my life and I think about how we use the word love, do you know what the definition is? The working definition in our everyday life is? It's to feel good about something or someone. When we say love, oftentimes what we're suggesting is, I feel good about that. I love peanut butter M&Ms. Why? Because they taste delicious, all right? I love them. And you know what? I love the Indians because they're winning right now. And when they're not winning, I still love the Indians. It just doesn't feel the same way. And then we translate this over into our workplace and our marriage and our relationships and our statements about loving other people. And you know why I think this is how we typically operationally define love is because I see it all the time with my kids. Because when I give some sort of discipline in response to something that they're not living up to, being disrespectful or whatever, do you know what they say back to me? Dad, you don't love me anymore. You don't love me. Have your kids ever said that? Did you ever say that? But essentially, what are they saying? I don't like how you're making me feel. And if that's really what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, then we're only going to love people when it feels good. And when it doesn't, how dare you make me feel this way? Now, love is so much bigger than that. In fact, the word love here is a verb. It is action-oriented. It is to welcome, to entertain, to be fond of, to take care of. I put it this way in your notes. Love is when we value and build up the well-being of someone else. When we build up someone's well-being, when we value their well-being, this takes work. This takes action. So when they say love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, essentially what they're saying is value God and allow Him to build up your well-being because He's God. Let Him build up your whole well-being, not just on Sunday for an hour, but in your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then when it says to love your neighbors yourself, value the people around you. Value the people that you're married to, committed to, friends with, family with, people at work, and build up their well-being. And first, to a certain extent, we intuitively understand that when we frame it that way. And what I love is, at this point, everybody in Jesus' audience is nodding their head around loving God and loving your neighbor. And Jesus intentionally chooses his response to the man's answer. He says this, "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." You have answered correctly, but do this and you will live. In other words, the right answer does not equal action. You can answer, you can say the right loving thing, and still not be a loving person. You can say I love you to the people as they head out the door before bed. You can write love at the bottom of a note to someone else. You can put loving things on your social media page and still be a jerk. And maybe this is where maybe we should be paying a little bit more attention. Because I think it's really easy to start, lobbing all of these right action or right verbs, right statements, all to everybody else, and then not really do anything in our life. I mean, this past week, Diana Patton, South Toledo attendee, she's a great public speaker and leader in our community. She posted this statement about love, and it just caught my attention. Dr. Tony Evans, a pastor, says, love means to come passionately, caringly, and righteously, uprightly, pursue the well-being of another. The word there is pursue it. It is an action-oriented word. Bob Goff, who wrote the best-selling book, Love Does, he said this, in the end, love doesn't keep thinking about it and planning for it. Simply put, love does. Now, when I start thinking about this is where I get exhausted. I get tired. Because if love is really about action, well then, what action? And with who? And how can I love everybody? How can I do for everybody? What? I mean, do you feel this? Because, a few hundred years ago, loving your neighbor meant loving the 20 people in your tribe. I mean, that was relatively palatable. And, fast forward a few hundred years, you got the newspaper, and so it was primarily your region. And now, with social media and the news, what do we see? We see the heartbreak and devastation in our world. And then it's like, how can I love everybody? How can I love the people in love the people in Las Vegas? And if you don't post at the right time and say the right thing about Las Vegas, then you're not a loving person. And if you don't say this about this side, then you're not a loving person. Pretty soon, if you're like me, it becomes so overwhelming. You want to be a loving person. You want to try to, but you want to just retreat. And so we put up boundaries. And thoughts and prayers to you guys out there, because I don't know that I can do for everyone what I feel like I need to do. You start to feel vulnerable and overwhelmed. And what's amazing about this story is how strikingly relevant those feelings are, because you see them in the lawyer. The lawyer is feeling the same thing. Jesus said, do this and you will live. And so how does he respond? Well, he wanted to justify himself. And so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? The lawyer's feeling a little pressure. He's feeling tension. What do you do when you feel pressure and tension? What do you do when you feel vulnerable or backed up against the wall or a little unsure? If you do what I do, I get defensive. I start to justify my perspective and my answers and my why. Like, for example, I got probably 100 t-shirts. Yeah, I know. Pray for me. I got 100 t-shirts. And so what happens when a new t-shirt shows up and my wife goes, seriously? Another t-shirt? What do? I justify. I mean, come on. Lauren, listen, I don't have a lot of Cleveland Indians shirts, and this one's red, and they had a red out the other night, and it's that soft fabric. I mean, I got my whole list of reasons why, and after this weekend service, I hear of a couple of other people who have more than 100 t-shirts, so I have plenty of room to grow in this category in my life. I mean, I do this, you do this. Well, we justify why we do what we do. To justify is to show or prove that I am right. And so typically, when we feel defensive, when somebody points and says, you're prejudiced, we justify. That's not me. So those people over there, when there's a political posture that you don't agree with, you justify why they are fill in the blank jerks. You know what? They don't deserve. They deserve to be put on blast. And you know what? You know what's happening here? Is when the desire to justify who or what, when our desire to justify ourselves goes up, our capacity for love goes down. When we get defensive, when we start pulling out, the finger pistols and the social media blasts about those people over there, love leaves the building. Because you know what love is? Love is a gift. Love is a gift that you give, whether they deserve it or have earned it or not. You may not get it back. They may not reciprocate it. They might not deserve it. That's what makes love powerful. is when we are loved, most of the time we don't deserve it ourselves. So that's what makes it special. And so when we spend time trying to justify who deserves love and who doesn't, love has left the building. Now, you may be sitting there going, but Ben, we need boundaries. We need boundaries in our life to keep unhealthy, toxic people out of our life. And I would agree, we need boundaries. But when the only reason we use boundaries is to keep those people out, is to put up these barriers so that they're not allowed to be in our life, we misunderstand what boundaries are about. Because in the Bible, the way that Jesus teaches about boundaries are invitational. They are invitational guardrails towards a healthy relationship, not a barrier that refuses to allow people to move forward. That's why boundaries are beneficial. They're always an invite towards healthy relationship. And if someone is unwilling to move towards healthy relationship, they have opted out of the boundaries. But it's always an invitation towards love. And so let's stop justifying who all of the time. Because when we do, love leaves the room. And what's amazing about this story is Jesus sees beyond the question that the lawyer is asking, and he sees the root issue. And instead of putting him on blast and pointing out how arrogant or selfish or racist he is and self-consumed he is, he decides to tell a story. He tells a story about a man leaving Jerusalem and going to Jericho. Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level, and 17 miles away, 800 feet below sea level, is Jericho. Essentially, you're going from the mountains of Jerusalem to the shores of the Dead Sea, and I've been here. I've taken the journey via bus, and it is a winding, twisting, rocky, tumultuous road. They would have known that it was a dangerous place for really anybody to travel. And so Jesus sets the stage. A man was taking the journey, and he was attacked by robbers and left for dead. This probably is a story they've heard before. And then Jesus introduces character number one, the priest. The priest, everybody would have known, knows the right answer. The priest teaches the right answer, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And he comes across this man, this Jewish man, who has been left for dead. And what happens? I mean, many of you know the story. If not, you can read it for yourself in your notes later. He comes across a man, and it says that he passed by on the other side. What happened? Well, I imagine he probably looked at him. He said, well, I've got some commitments in Jerusalem. People are waiting on me. I've got some things to do. You know what? I know he needs help, but I don't know how much time. I don't know if I have the capacity. It'll make a mess. Maybe he said he should have known better. I mean, look at what he's wearing. He was asking for it. It's his own fault. Either way, he justified why he didn't have to love him, and he continued on his journey. And then Jesus introduces the second character, a Levite. A Levite would have been an assistant in the temple, and says that the Levite comes across the man who was robbed and left for dead, and he comes to the same conclusion. And the Levite would have known the right answer too. I mean, the Levite's job was to work in the temple, and maybe the Levite saw the priest, and he saw the priest from a distance see the man and go around the other side, and he came to the conclusion, well, if the priest didn't, I don't have to. Have you ever done that? Well, if they didn't say this, if they weren't then I don't think I have to be that way either. Either way, the Levite comes to the same conclusion and leaves the man and continues on his journey, justifying why he was right in his own mind. Even though he knew the right answer, didn't live it out. And at this point in the story, the lawyer, I imagine the lawyer is thinking the same thing that you and I are thinking when we read this story. What dirtbags? I mean, I can't believe that they would pass by somebody who was dying on the side of the road. How arrogant is that? Come on, we all know that we should love our neighbor. I would never do anything like that. And then Jesus introduces the third character, the Samaritan. And the lawyer would have said, uh-oh. Because suddenly this went somewhere that he wasn't expecting. Because at this point, everybody in Jesus' audience would have known that the story is much bigger than the man who was hurting on the side of the road. Because in a Jewish context, the way that they value people, the way that they build up the well-being of others is built on a hierarchy. At the top of the list is a kosher Jew, a Jew who follows the law and follows the dietary restrictions that come with it. Below them, a non-kosher Jew. That means they follow the law, but they don't always stick with all the dietary restrictions and, details of the law. Below that would be a poor Jew. This is somebody who probably wants to honor the law, but their socioeconomic status really keeps them from living it out to the degree that somebody wealthier could. And below that is a sinful Jew, somebody who's still Jewish, but not really living out the law. And below that is a Gentile, a non-Jewish person. And below that is a tax collector, which is a Jewish person who decides to work for the Roman Empire. They're worse than a sinner and worse than a Gentile, because they're collecting our money and giving it back to Rome. And below them was a Samaritan. You see, Jewish people would refer to Samaritans as half-breeds. It would be a derogatory statement because they were half Jewish and half Gentile. And certainly, Samaritans don't know the right answer. The hostility between Samaritans and Jews went back hundreds of years. And what did the Samaritan do in the story? Well, the Samaritan stops. Jesus says that the Samaritan had pity, had compassion for a Jewish individual who may never reciprocate this kind of pity back. In fact, this Jewish individual may have had nasty things to say about Samaritans, but the Samaritan had pity on him. He valued him. And then, not only did he value him, he began to build up his well-being. He began to step in and bandage his wounds and put him on his own transportation, the donkey, and traveled with him all the way to an inn and paid for his stay and promised to come back and take care of everything else. And at this point in the story, everybody would have been given a vivid picture of what love your neighbor as yourself was really all about. Maybe the upside-down principle pivots on that two-letter word, as. Do you know what that word means? To the same degree. Love your neighbor to the same degree as yourself. And I know what people say in our culture today is that, you've got to love yourself first. Because if you don't learn how to love yourself first, you don't have any love to give other people. And what that has led way to is this twisted narcissism where, I wake up most of the time and I don't love what I see in the mirror. I don't love myself very much. And so if I don't love myself very much, I don't have to love you. And that's not what Jesus is teaching here. Remember, he's referring back to the two things. Love God and love your neighbor. Essentially, he's saying, to the degree in which you and I remember how God valued and built up our well-being, as we remember how God has loved us, as you remember how God has loved yourself, to the same degree, love your neighbor the same way. Love others the same way. So for me and for you, when we receive the fact that God values us, that we don't manufacture love for ourselves, we receive an undeserved love from God. When we receive that, and when we see how he has built up our well-being, then that means he has that same value and that same desire for the people who have those other perspectives in your life. Easy to say, challenging to live. At this point in the story with Jesus' audience and with the lawyer, Jesus' point is clear. You're asking the wrong question. Essentially, Jesus is saying, get your as in gear. Get your as, the two-letter word, in gear. We need to walk out of here when we say love your neighbor as yourself. We need to get that same degree. Imagine what could happen if we were to embrace that. Jesus so masterfully takes the two good guys who knew the right answer and set them on one side and took a traditional bad guy and made him the hero of the story. And then instead of shaming the lawyer and instead of trying to drill home a preachy point, a tweet, a sub-tweet, or some other social media dig, he just asks a question. I love the words that he chooses. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Again, it would appear that the lawyer got it right. I mean, Jesus asked, who was the one who was a neighbor? And he said, the one who valued and built up the well-being of another. But what was Jesus' question? Which of the three? Who were the three? The priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. And the man can't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. I mean, the Samaritan asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Priest, Levite, Samaritan. You see, what Jesus was going after was some of this lawyer's prejudices about who deserved his love. And so instead of asking who, let's ask a bigger question. Let's ask, what does love require of you? If you're taking notes, write that down. Instead of asking who deserves my love, let's ask a bigger question. What does love require of you and me? And you know what? The answer for you in your context and in your workplace and in your marriage and with your friends might look a little differently than me. This isn't a silver bullet. This is a posture. This is a posture with which we live our life with the people that God brings across our path. I mean, essentially, at the end of this conversation, Jesus looks at the expert in the law and he says, go and do likewise. In other words, be like the Samaritan. Who are the Samaritans in your life? In your workplace? In your family? You know, it's those people. And what would change if we started asking the question, what does love require of me here? What does it look like for me to value them and build up their well-being? Yeah, but Ben, they don't. Remember, when we try to increase or justify who, it decreases our capacity for love. But when we receive the degree to which God has valued and built us up, that is what is required to love our neighbor. We don't have it in our own strength. That's why we talk about, in the spiritual journey, that first step, know God, is critical. Because as we know God, as we receive His grace, that becomes the resource by which we can love our neighbor in a way that God has loved us. That's what gives some extra emphasis to verses like our memory verse for this series. You have heard it said to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I know there's some talk about the emptiness of prayers. Keep your thoughts and prayers to yourself. If prayers are only a tweet back to God or a complaint about that leader that's driving you crazy or that person or that group, if that's all prayer is, then of course it's empty. But prayer is so much bigger than that. Prayer is about us connecting with God and receiving from Him what we need, what we lack. Prayer says this: when there's an enemy or someone who has that side opposed to me, God, help me see how valuable they are to you. And give me the courage to build them up the way that you built me up, even when I didn't deserve it. If you don't have a personal relationship with God, if you don't know how to know God in your life, then this is going to be really difficult. In fact, if you're curious and want to know more about that, flip over your message notes. On the bottom corner, there's an experience called Growth Track that's happening right now at all of our campuses. I would encourage you to take that. At the first week of the month, we talk about knowing God, and we go into a little bit more in depth as to how you can do that in your life. I would encourage you, maybe that's the practical step that you need to take in order to love your neighbor as yourself today. Do you know another practical step that may be where you're at is to find freedom? Finding freedom is basically getting past those places in our life where we're stuck. Anger, bitterness, unforgiveness, prejudice. Do you know how you get past those things? You have an authentic conversation with someone else. You know what's helped me understand some of my own blind prejudices that I may have in my life is sitting down with someone who doesn't look and talk and act the way that I do, that doesn't have the same upbringing that I do, and especially with some of these issues in our culture, help me understand from your perspective and listen instead of justify. It has opened my eyes to other perspectives. Instead of getting defensive, man, it has helped me have compassion for people who have a much different experience in our country than I have. And I think the more that we do that, the more we listen to each other, imagine what it could turn our country right side up. Instead of finger pointing and blasting each other, the next time you want to tell the rest of the world on social media why they're wrong, ask the question, what does love require of me here? You know what it requires? That we learn how to ask better questions and listen to each other. Man. Some people go, well, why is it that we can't see God? Why is it that he chose to be invisible? At least the way that I read the Bible, is love. Our love for each other and for the world is how an invisible God becomes visible to the world. And so maybe this upside-down principle is bigger than we could ever imagine. And maybe part of the reason you're here at this point in human history is because God looked at you and me. He looked at us and thought, these are the people who can step into this. Of any point in human history, he chose you for today. He chose me for today. So instead of running and hiding and complaining and pointing, let's step into the challenge with a new courage to love our neighbor the way that God has loved us. And then let's watch God use us to potentially transform our workplace, our families, our communities, and our country the way that we are all craving. It's going to come as we value and build up the well-being of others, as we stop justifying who, as we understand that it's not just the right answer, but it's the action that comes with it. It'll come as we get our as in gear. And so let's make that our prayer today. God, thank you that you put us in this country for this day, for these issues. Help us sense that you see purpose in our lives so that we have the courage to step into the reality today with this upside down principle in our marriage, in our workplace, with our friends and family, in our culture. God, help us to love our neighbor as you have loved us. And thank you for your courageous love in our life. Now give us the clarity and boldness to do the same with the people, with the neighbors that you put around us each and every day. God, help us to see, what does love require of me? Help us to ask that each day and to have the courage to respond. Take our lives and turn this upside down country right side up again. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much.